Welcome back. Screencast number 4 for Economic Globalization. My name is Alex Wiseman, and we've just been talking about Wade's chapter in the Globalization Reader by Lecter and Bolai, titled "Is Globalization Reducing Poverty and Inequality?" And we looked at his arguments, sort of saying there's this neoliberal perspective that says the answer is yes. There's a more left perspective that says the answer is no. There are some reasons why each of these groups says what they say. But if we look actually at the trend of world income distribution to try to get some sort of an answer to this, what we come up with is really a little bit of a mixed bag. We see that the way that income distribution is measured is important. We see that the sample that is included in most of the calculations of income distribution worldwide is important. And what he comes up with is a set of 3 propositions that basically suggest, and he provides evidence to back up each, that world income distribution actually is becoming more unequal, and that income polarization has increased, and that between country income inequality has increased. Right? But then he ends by proposition 4 saying that world income inequality has been constant or falling when you weight countries by population. And so what he's saying is that, look, it's important to note that with this measure here, this way of thinking about it at the bottom, that the proportion of the world's population living in extreme poverty has probably fallen over the past several decades. This is what he says on the last page of the section in this book. But what he also goes on to suggest is that there are some problems with the way, in particular, the World Bank measures poverty. And there's some problems in the distributions that are calculated, because if you take out China and if you take out India, 2 of the largest and most rapidly shifting economies in the world over the past several decades, you come up with 2 different results, right? When you include China and India, it looks like, and it does appear that when you're counting for the world's population, that extreme poverty has, yes, fallen over the past several decades. But when you remove those 2 sort of outliers, I know it's kind of hard to think of countries that large and that important as outliers, but when you remove them from the equation, so to speak, what you find instead is rapidly more unequal, increased polarization, and increased income inequality, right, overall. So we have both a neoliberal and a leftist approach finding some data that supports them. Right? Maybe we're leaning a little bit more towards the left than towards the neoliberal argument, but we still find that that's there. All right. Now that's important for us because as we shift to thinking a little more about education, and specifically where education falls in this, the idea of the globalization of economies and how that has influenced what education is, how it is produced, how we think about it, what the effect is on individuals, and then how education itself creates its own institutionalization. We come up with an argument that might be similar to something that David Baker provides in his book, The Schooled Society, which we'd also been looking at in this class. And he starts chapter 7 in The Schooled Society by looking at 2 quotes from sort of 2 ends of the spectrum, 2 ways of thinking about education and the economy that have played into the more neoliberal perspective on the one hand and the more left perspective on the other. The one by Theodore Schultz. He is an economist. At the time when he said this quote, 1961 presidential address to the American Economic Association, Theodore Schultz is one of the people credited with developing human capital theory, which we'll talk about in a second. And Theodore Schultz said, "Laborers have become capitalists not from a diffusion of the ownership of corporation stocks, as folklore would have it, but from the acquisition of knowledge and skill that have economic value." Now the idea here is that, the idea behind human capital in general, is that as individuals collect knowledge and skill, their economic value increases. Right? So the more education you have in terms of quantity as well as quality, the more you are able to exchange that knowledge and skill for money, for an income, for some sort of value. Right? That is the human capital approach. That is the neoliberal sort of idea as well about how we think about education and what education contributes to our economic potential or productivity or participation. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, you have someone like Ronald Dorr, a sociologist who in 1976 wrote a very important piece called The Diploma Disease. It's been reprinted a lot. He's done The Diploma Disease Revisited, and it's something that David Baker talks about quite extensively in the Schooled Society. But what Dorr says in The Diploma Disease is that schools used to be for educating people, for developing minds and characters. I already have a problem with this because this looks back at some sort of golden age, which I don't think ever existed. But anyway, schools used to be for educating people, for developing minds and characters. Today, as jobs depend more and more on certificates, degrees, and diplomas, aims and motives are changing. Schooling has become more and more a ritualized process of qualification earning, which is ritualistic, tedious, suffused with anxiety and boredom, destructive of curiosity and imagination, in short, anti-educational. And the way that Dorr thinks about it is sort of this upward spiral, where you get greater and greater levels of education and certification, but without necessarily having any commensurate outcome from that, which we could say is one of the reasons why people with PhDs are sometimes found, mowing lawns in the United States, or washing dishes, or doing things that their high education level would not necessarily predict that they do. Now, what Baker says is that both of these positions, both the extreme left and the extreme right, both the neoliberal and the left, both the human capital and the sort of Marxist sociological left, ignore the power of education as an institution to not only train and allocate students, but also to transform understandings and expectations for people's capabilities, the nature of work, and even what is usable knowledge for economic value. Now, this is a key summary here that he gives us right at the beginning of chapter 7 in the Schooled Society. Right? Now, how do we think about this? How do we think about what this power of education as an institution is? Well, one of the ways to think about it is to remember that David Baker is flipping the impact direction between education and society. The traditional way of thinking about education is that it is shaped by society. It is a causal output or outcome of society. That changes in society equal changes in education. And what he does is he flips that a little bit and he says, what if education as an institution has grown and has established itself and embedded itself to such a large degree in the collective, psyche of people around the world, that education as an institution itself has the kind of power that we used to only believe that society could have. And then that instead of society impacting education, it's the institution of education that is now impacting society. It's quite a big flip, right? And it's important to recognize that flip. And if you've had time to look at some of the figures and charts from the Schooled Society, you'll see that in one of the earlier chapters we read, one of the figures associated with that does look at that flip for us. Okay, so if we think about that, then we can start to think about, all right, we're not only training and allocating students, right? That's a basic function that schools provide. But we're also transforming understandings and expectations for people's capabilities. Transforming the understanding and expectations for what we can do. Also transforming those things for the nature of work, and transforming those things for what is usable knowledge for economic value. what actually has economic value. Now, if you think about it a little bit, think about how maybe in your own experience with education, there is somewhat of a divorce between what you learned in school and what you actually use in the labor market. Right? Was that stuff that you learned in history class really relevant to the job that you either recently had or expect that you will have? Does it directly translate? Probably not. However, the idea that it's expected that that kind of information is useful or usable knowledge for economic value is an important one. The understanding that that is the kind of information, that the kind of stuff you get in school is what people need, is an important one, even if it doesn't directly translate to the labor market. In fact, it often doesn't, and there's a relearning period that occurs. So what he says is that there's been a symbiosis, in particular between, or there's been a flip between the causal direction between education and society, so that society and education are not in the same order that they once were. Education as an institution now impacting society in a way that we couldn't imagine, 50 years ago or 100 years ago. But in addition to that, there's been a symbiosis, he argues, between mass education and work. In other words, they've come together so that the ways that we conceptualize work, the ways that we conceptualize the economy, are completely embedded in ways that mass education helps us think about what knowledge and skill is and how we define ourselves by what we know. And he says there are 4 ways, all right? 4 ways. So let's just walk through each of these quickly. First is how wrong, he says, dire predictions were that the education revolution would produce extensive over-education and thus social upheaval. In other words, there were those who predicted that the spread of mass education worldwide, this upward spiral of ever-increasing levels of educational attainment, would eventually lead in some sort of social upheaval, because people would get to a point where they have maxed out on education and there was nowhere to go or use this, and so over-education would result, which would then hurt what we did in society, because people would not know how to allocate themselves into particular labor market roles. Second, he says, contrary to older visions of jobs and worker skills, more waves of educated individuals flooding the workplace spreads a kind of mass professionalization of work. Now, this is the idea that this mass professionalization of work, that the ways that education as an institution embeds expectations about knowledge and skills and what is legitimized knowledge and skill, because it would be that you receive from formal mass education, has changed the way that we conceptualize work. In other words, there are experts in work in areas where we might not have expected that to be before. And he provides several sort of first world examples, which I will reiterate here. For example, people who cut our hair, barbers or hairstylists or whatever you want to call, are certified to do so. They have dedicated schools that teach them how to do that, with instructors who are trained how to do it. They receive diplomas or certificates at the end of that, and they are licensed then to cut hair, right, as a result of that. Now, this is all, he argues, tied to the symbiosis between mass education and work, because it completely embeds something that is not necessarily a knowledge economy type of a profession or career into a professionalized or an expert-driven expectation. Third, firms are adapting their profit-seeking strategies to the skills and work habits of educated employees with accompanying changes in technology and the workplace. This is the idea that the ways that education, mass education, is producing individuals, the people that are coming out of mass education systems, are actually changing the way that the labor market looks to do what they do, to produce widgets, to provide services, etc., rather than vice versa. He's arguing that education as an institution has more of an impact on the labor market and the economy than the labor market and the economy does on education as an institution. And he says that's so because we see the labor market changing rather than education as an institution changing to deal with the other. We're going to pause here and come back in the next screencast.